Perhaps what I'll do to start off this morning is just give you a bit of an overview of who we are and where we have some operations globally, because I'll use that as a basis to perhaps make some comments about the EU, where we're very active, or trying to be active, and perhaps the UK. So Hutton is a private company. We have a specific focus on developing assets in Europe. As per the introduction, we have about 1.3 million acres, primarily in Poland and the Ukraine, and a whole range of pending activity in a number of other countries, which I'll talk to. Interestingly enough, we started with a focus on shale, and we've broadened that out now with a focus on potentially some conventional targets, but using unconventional techniques. So what we're finding, and Eric alluded to this, that we're finding the new techniques that have been driven and developed by the shale gas revolution in the US is opening up new opportunities in perhaps some old fields which were drilled when oil prices were much lower and when the technology wasn't available to perhaps make them economic. So I think Europe and the UK will also benefit from this new technology which may be used on some of those conventional fields, and that's certainly an interesting focus for us at the moment. If you just have a look globally, we do have a footprint in a number of other regions around the world. I start with the Marcellus, the founders of the group got involved there in 2004 as one of the first entrants into that particular play. They're now active and participate in over 300 producing shale gas wells, not only in that basin but in other shale basins of the US. The Duvernay Shale and the Montney Shale in Canada, and also the Bakken on the Canadian side, all developing shale plays over the last few years. Australia, a tight gas play there, and I'll reference some of these later on when I make some comments. And Poland and the Ukraine I've already spoken to. When we compare, as a relatively small group that we are, each of these opportunities, one of the things we always weigh up is where is the best place to invest your money in exploration, which is primarily what we do. And I'll talk about some of the processes we go through in a very small group and with a limited amount of cash, and how that has an impact perhaps on development here in Europe and the UK. So this is Europe, just to bring it closer to home. Poland primarily, the Ukraine, and as you go to the west, unfortunately, very limited activity. Although we started within all these countries within about 12 months of each other 3 years ago. The only place we've been able to get any wells drilled is Poland and the Ukraine. The rest of Europe is, as I'm sure you well know, between geopolitical and regulatory issues, there just hasn't been any progress. If I can just talk to this slide for a minute and make a couple of points. For a country to be attractive for oil and gas investment, it needs to get some basic things right. And people often ask the question, how has it happened so quickly in the US? Well, it's because they got these three things right. The fiscal environment, it's got to be competitive. The taxes need to be right. They need to be developed in a way that appreciates, certainly with unconventional development, it's very front-loaded with costs. A massive amount of investment needs to go in drilling the initial wells, which are essentially research projects, before you get to a point where you may actually bring some gas to surface. The regulatory environment is critical. It's no point having support from senior ministers and presidents and PMs if the bureaucrats that are processing a lot of these permits and applications aren't resourced or don't have the capability to issue permits to enable development. And I think this is almost where we are here in the UK now. We're getting certainly very strong support at a senior ministerial level, but perhaps not the regulatory framework that anybody's prepared to support to enable wells to be drilled. And there's no shortcut to developing a shale play. You need to drill the wells. And Poland is exactly the same. We've been operating out there now for 4 years, and at the government level, tremendous support, and even right down to the regions. But the backlog of drilling permits and licence modifications in that country is actually slowing down the ability to drill wells. So while it is the only place we can drill wells, and there's been 45 test wells drilled there in the last 3 years, there should have been 145, and there would have been if the regulatory environment was in place to enable that to happen. And it's just about outlining very clearly what the rules are. The industry is very good at managing and operating within those guidelines, but they need to be very clear and transparent, and they need to be practical. And in most cases, because we've seen this potential explosion of activity in onshore Europe, for example, there hasn't really been much activity in the last 20 or 30 years, so the regulatory environment is just not in place. Or if it was in place, it was cumbersome and inefficient, which didn't matter when there was 1 or 2 operators in each country. Now there's 20 or 30 in the case of Poland, and it's actually choking the development. So you can get one of these things right, but if you don't have the processes right, then it's not going to be attractive to invest in the development of that activity. And the UK at the moment is sitting, I think, potentially in that sort of space. Political stability, we could talk about that, but let's perhaps not go there in any detail. Suffice to say that, primarily in the EU, that box is ticked. But if you look at the US, they were able to put the regulatory environment in place, the tax systems in place, the fiscal environment was competitive enough, and companies spent a lot of money on the basis that they were actually able to either prove or disprove their asset and move on. And we just haven't seen that same process here in Europe. Just a couple of dot points, and this is picking up on comments over the last 2 days. Transparency is obviously key. It doesn't matter what community you're working in whatever country, whether it's the Ukraine, where we can get a well drilled in 3 months, permitted and drilled in 3 months, or whether it's in the UK or North America. You've got to be clear and open about what you're doing. And that's before, as someone pointed out, that's actually before you start. That's almost as soon as you get the licence, you need to start that work. And that's a big cost, because you have to actually get right down to the grassroots with that communication strategy. Engagement, we use community advisory boards. Everybody's got some sexy name for what they have, where the local mayor, some local community representatives, ourselves, the local priest in some cases, whoever the key stakeholders are in those communities, and actually have a formal commitment about how you're going to communicate, how often you meet, the information you might be driving out of that cab to the rest of the community. Addressing the myths, I think we've come a long way with this. I was encouraged yesterday when the debate with the environmental groups was taking place. They didn't really talk about water and water contamination. I've sat on those panels a year or 2 ago, and that was all we spoke about was contaminating groundwater. Now they just talk about CO2 emissions. That seems to be their whole focus. They're also reluctantly admitted that if it's done well, they believe it can be done safely. Now that is a huge move from where we were not that long ago. Now I'm sure they're still going to be out with their placards with groundwater contamination issues and those types of things, but the discussion certainly at the more senior level within those organisations is moved from targeting taps that are exploding and groundwater issues, contamination issues, to a CO2 agenda, and I think that's a positive sign, because I think they're running out of material, if you like, that has been progressively debunked over the last year or two, which is where we were in the hysteria mode with Gasland and other movies at the time, we seem to progress from that, and I think that's positive. That's not to say I don't think we need to be dealing with those, because at different levels people have different levels of the community, different levels of understanding about how they need to be dealing with some of these questions, so we need to keep feeding that out. But I think it was encouraging that it was a CO2 debate yesterday almost, rather than contamination of groundwater, which is what we got stuck on 2 years ago, or even a year ago. Sharing the upside. Explaining the difference between exploration and production. This is, while it sounds quite simple, is quite key when you're going into a local community or even with government. An exploration well, you come in, you drill it, it takes a month. You might come back a couple of months later and frack it. That takes a week, and then you may never be back, because it may not be. You may not see the results. So the impact on that local community, either potential upside of jobs and domestic gas supply and all those other potential things, will probably never happen. And it's important to make that clear at the beginning, because we've seen, particularly in Poland, that the expectation when you go and drill a well is that you're going to produce gas. Well, at the moment, the research wells, we're still in the beginning of the process. So in fact, it's highly likely, in fact, almost 99% chance that well will not go into production. So you need to get the expectations at the right level. When you're in a production mode, then that's completely different. You're generating revenue, you're generating activity, jobs, both locally and regionally, and even at a country level. Then that's the opportunity for the local communities to really engage and benefit. But the exploration wells, and this is, I guess, where Cordrilla is now, you're in and out, and it's probably never going to produce, particularly if it's a vertical. So it's about just getting that message right at the beginning. And also, sorry to continue on that theme, it's very tight. The exploration programs are very expensive. You generally don't get returns on them. So it's not necessarily the right time for communities to have high expectations of what a company might be able to do for them, other than some of the things that would have been talked about with small community type projects, because you may never see them after that first 6 months of activity. Sharing the upside, I mean, when you try and compare the US with almost any other jurisdiction of the world, clearly the major difference when you're dealing at the community level is that the stakeholders there have a vested interest in a successful well. So we need to develop these processes in the other jurisdictions where the hydrocarbons are owned by the state. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel on some of these things. I mean, some of the processes were talked about yesterday about cheaper heating bills, for example, and I think that's some very obvious things that we can do to tick the box. But I think it needs to also be more related to a region, and how big that region is will depend, I guess, or change by country, frankly. But, if we look at, I use an example out of Western Australia where we have our Warra gas field. They have a process there called royalties for regions, and the idea is that it's essentially a levy on hydrocarbon production that is captured and then redistributed back out to the regional communities. Australia is an extreme example because 80% of the population live in 4 cities, so the regions actually don't get access to a lot of that funding, or historically anyway, that would be then captured by the state, taxes or certainly employment in the capital cities. And this was a mechanism that redistributed some of that back out to the regions. So you're dealing with a reward on an individual level, and let's use the heating discount as an example, and you're also providing significant funding at a regional level, which may be infrastructure projects, schools, hospitals, those types of things, which are a scale again bigger than perhaps what an individual company may be able to do, and it's redeployed back out to those areas that are involved in producing, in Australia it's minerals and hydrocarbons, but in this case hydrocarbons. So there is examples around that where it has been able to work. And when you're seeing those benefits get back, then you get a much more engaged local community that are more interested in hearing everything about the opportunity, just not the downside. Baseline monitoring was talked about yesterday. It's absolutely critical. The US started, 10 or 15 years ago without a lot of this. We've learned from that now. I think that's just a starting point for any activity here in Europe or the UK. The final point before I finish is a competitive energy environment. The benefits of that are enormous. You look at the US, heavy industry now expanding for the first time in 30 years. And it's because they have cheap energy. It's that simple. And people talk about energy security all the time. I personally believe it's more than that. It's about being competitive. And that is about security, that's about price, that's about access, it's about stability. So a competitive energy environment, if Europe and the UK can't be competitive with what it's paying for its energy, doesn't matter where the source is, then you'll have places like North America dragging heavy industry back. You have China with the biggest unconventional reserves in place globally. In 10 years' time will be producing enormous amounts of their own domestic gas. And if Europe can't compete with that, then all of that current manufacturing activity, even the high-end tech, will disappear to those other nations that have a competitive energy environment. So I think it's important that UK, Europe embraces this opportunity, because in 10 years' time, when everybody else has some level of domestic energy supply and a competitive energy environment, the EU will be left a long way behind. Thanks.
Very much. A recent European consultation that was published in April of this year, 26,000 individual responses from Europe, of which half of them were Polish, and very, very positive about shale gas exploration in that country. Why?
I think Poland, like other countries in Central Europe, has come out of a difficult regime only 20 years ago. They're fiercely independent as a culture. They like to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and they like to know that in this case, in this current environment, they have an energy resource that they want to develop. They can't see the sense in leaving it in the ground when it has so much opportunity at every level, whether it be the local community or whether it be at a federal level, to generate jobs and industry. I think their approach is very much about independence and very much about creating opportunities for jobs, for heavy industry, and the Polish, probably more so, given that I've had some experience in the Czech Republic and other areas that are slightly different, are very much more focused on some of those key issues than other countries. I think the other thing that probably helps is once people see a drilling rig turn up and leave a month later, or a frac crew turn up and leave, they do realise it actually hasn't been that much of a burden on their community. And Poland has had more exposure to that than any other country in the last 5 years. So it's the fear of the unknown in most places rather than the positive or experiences of people who have seen what happens and perhaps realise that it's not going to have a big impact on their local community from a negative perspective I'm talking about. So they're more positive. The experience hasn't been negative, I guess, is the positive outcome.
Good, thank you. I'll take one question from the audience.
Here you go. Yeah, thanks very much. It's very much to do with the. It's very much to do with the issues about regulation that you were talking about and how it would hold things on. What are the problems in the UK with regulation? Why do you see it as holding things on?
I guess the situation I see in the UK is a will at senior political levels to explore this opportunity, but when you actually come down to acquiring a permit to drill a well, that process taking a long time. So a disconnect between, or in some cases, not available until perhaps very recently. So a disconnect between a high-level drive by government to explore and develop an opportunity and the ability to actually get on the ground and do it.